Unlock the safe, and 100 million will be yours, joked the billionaire. But the poor girl surprised him. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe buttons, like and share this video. Then comment where you are watching from. We will love to know how far this story has gone. The 52nd floor penthouse boardroom of Sterling Tower overlooked Manhattan like a throne room surveying an empire. For the past 4 hours, Adam Sterling had watched his crisis unfold with growing fury. The military-grade biometric vault at the center of his conference room, custom designed by former defense contractors and equipped with layers of encryption that even government agencies envied, had locked itself during a routine system update. Inside were documents for a merger worth billions, contracts that needed his signature in less than 90 minutes, and enough leverage to destroy his competitors. The vault wasn't just refusing to open, it had become completely unresponsive. "Sir, we've exhausted every override protocol," announced Dr. Raymond Chen, the lead security engineer, his voice tight with professional embarrassment. Behind him, a team of 6 specialists, each commanding fees of $500 per hour, stood surrounded by diagnostic equipment that blinked uselessly. Thermal scanners, electromagnetic pulse devices, proprietary decryption software, all of it worthless against a lock that had simply stopped recognizing any input whatsoever. The manufacturer in Munich had been on a video call for the past hour, equally baffled. Adam Sterling, at 38 years old, was a man accustomed to solutions. As the founder of Sterling Global Ventures, and heir to a real estate empire built by his late father, he had negotiated with presidents, outmaneuvered corporate sharks, and turned failing companies into billion-dollar successes. His reputation was built on control, on having answers before questions were even asked. Yet here he stood, in a $12,000 suit, unable to access his own property. The irony was suffocating. He could purchase the building across the street with a phone call, but he couldn't open a door in his own office. Through the floor to ceiling windows behind him, New York City stretched endlessly. The morning sun glinted off glass towers that pierced the clouds, each one representing empires, fortunes, and power consolidated in the hands of a few. Far below, barely visible from this height, the streets teemed with a different reality. It was a world of subway platforms that smelled of urine and despair, of shelters that turned away more people than they helped, of children who learned to sleep with one eye open. Adam Sterling had climbed out of that world 20 years ago and never looked back. He had erased every trace of the hungry boy from Queens who once wore the same pair of shoes for 3 winters. From his penthouse, poverty was invisible. But today, those 2 worlds were about to collide in a way that would shatter everything Adam Sterling believed about power, worth, and divine intervention. A small figure was already in the building, having slipped past security during the morning rush when guards were distracted by a delivery truck accident. She moved through the service corridors with the practiced silence of someone who had learned that invisibility was survival. In her torn pocket was a photograph, the last thing she owned of value, though its worth could never be measured in dollars. She was coming closer with every step, pulled forward by a force she didn't fully understand but had learned to trust. The voice that sounded like her mother. The whisper that promised she was exactly where she needed to be. Ellie Parker had been homeless for 7 months, ever since the night her mother died in a hospital bed, holding Ellie's hand and whispering final words that made no sense at the time. "God gave you something special, baby. Something that will help people see him when they've forgotten how to look. Don't be afraid when the moment comes. He'll show you what to do." At 9 years old, Ellie had watched her only parent slip away, then watched the state take what little they owned to cover medical debts. 3 different foster placements in 4 months, each one worse than the last, until she'd simply walked away one night and disappeared into the city's shadows. Today, hunger gnawed at her stomach with familiar cruelty. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, surviving on water from park fountains and the half-finished coffee someone left on a bench yesterday morning. Her feet were bare because her shoes had fallen apart 2 weeks ago, and her clothes were held together more by dirt than thread. She had learned which subway cars to sleep in, which alleys the police didn't patrol, and which dumpsters behind restaurants were worth checking. But she had also learned something else, something that defied explanation. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes and listened to the silence beneath the city's noise, she heard instructions, gentle guidance that had kept her safe when danger circled close, that told her which strangers to avoid and which ones carried kindness hidden behind hard faces. Her mother had called it a gift. The social workers had called it trauma response. Ellie just knew it was real. This morning, the voice had been clearer than ever. Go to the tall building with the silver top. Climb as high as you can. Don't be afraid. So, she had come, slipping through doors that others had carelessly left propped open. Riding service elevators when maintenance workers weren't looking, following a pull she couldn't explain and didn't question. As she approached the 52nd floor, her heart hammered not from fear, but from certainty. Something waited for her behind those double doors. Something that would change everything. Inside the boardroom, Adam Sterling checked his watch for the 20th time. 70 minutes until his deadline. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from lawyers, investors, and board members. His reputation was about to take a devastating hit, and there was nothing he could do except wait for a miracle he didn't believe in. He was about to learn that miracles rarely arrive the way we expect them. The boardroom doors burst open. Marcus, the head of building security, rushed in, dragging someone by the arm. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we caught this kid trying to get into your private elevator. Should I call the police or—" Adam turned, irritation flashing across his face, and then stopped. Standing in his boardroom, impossibly small, against the backdrop of wealth and power, was a child. A girl, no more than 9 or 10, with tangled blonde hair that hung past her shoulders and clothes that looked like they'd been salvaged from a trash heap. Her face was smudged with dirt, her arms were covered in bruises and scratches, and her feet left small dusty prints on his white marble floor. But it was her eyes that made Adam pause. They were clear, calm, and utterly unafraid. She looked at him not with the shame or defiance he expected, but with something that resembled recognition, as if she had been expecting him too. The room fell silent. 6 security experts, 4 lawyers waiting via video conference, and Adam Sterling himself all stared at this impossible intrusion. Someone should have been outraged. Someone should have removed her immediately. But something about her presence commanded a strange respect, a weight that made no logical sense. Adam felt a forgotten memory stir. A boy with bare feet standing in a welfare office. A social worker's look of pity mixed with disgust. The shame of being visible when you wanted desperately to disappear. He shook it off and forced a cold smile. The merger, the pressure, the absurdity of the situation, all combined into a moment of cruel humor. He gestured broadly at the massive vault, dominating the center of the room, its steel surface reflecting the girl's small figure. "Tell you what, kid," Adam said, his voice dripping with mockery that made 2 of the lawyers shift uncomfortably. "You see that safe? My guys here, with all their fancy degrees and expensive equipment, can't get it open. So here's the deal." He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, playing to the room. "Unlock the safe, and $100 million will be yours. How's that sound?" The executives exchanged glances, a few suppressed smiles. Marcus looked uncertain whether to laugh or apologize. The whole thing was absurd, a moment of dark comedy in what had been an infuriating morning. But Ellie Parker didn't laugh. She didn't look away or shrink from the attention. Instead, she took 3 slow steps toward the vault, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Her lips moved in what might have been a whisper or a prayer. And then, with a calmness that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room, she spoke. "My mama told me that when people laugh at you, that's when God is about to do something nobody expects." Her voice was small but clear, carrying a weight that shouldn't have been possible from someone so young. She said, "He likes to use broken things, because that's when people can see it's really him working, not just somebody smart or lucky." The room had gone completely still. Adam's smile faltered. Something about her words touched a nerve he thought he'd successfully severed years ago. Ellie looked directly at him now, and in her gaze was something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Not accusation exactly, but recognition, as if she could see through the expensive suit and the carefully constructed armor of success to the frightened boy he'd once been. "I'm not smart enough to open your safe, mister," she continued, still moving closer to the vault. "But I don't think God brought me here to fail." She placed her small, dirty hand on the biometric scanner, and the impossible began to happen. The scanner, which had remained dark and unresponsive for 4 hours, suddenly blazed to life with a soft blue glow. The light spread across Ellie's palm, like water finding every crease and line, and the vault's digital display, which had shown nothing but error codes, began cycling through numbers too fast to read. A low hum filled the room, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Dr. Chen lunged forward, his face drained of color. "That's impossible. The system doesn't even have power routing to those actuators. We checked the vault door released with a pneumatic hiss that cut him off mid-sentence. The massive steel door swung open slowly, revealing rows of documents, hard drives, and stacks of bearer bonds inside. But no one was looking at the contents. Every eye in the room was fixed on the 9-year-old girl who stood with her hand still resting on the scanner, her expression serene and unsurprised, as if she had simply turned a doorknob instead of cracking a security system designed to withstand military-grade attacks. Chaos erupted immediately. The engineering team descended on the vault like investigators at a crime scene, pulling diagnostic equipment from their cases, running cable connections to the lock mechanism, shouting technical jargon that made no sense to anyone without advanced degrees. Marcus barked orders into his radio, calling for additional security personnel. The lawyers on the video conference abandoned all pretense of professionalism and pressed their faces close to their cameras, demanding someone explain what they'd just witnessed. Adam stood frozen, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had clearly seen. This wasn't possible. The vault used triple-layer authentication protocols, required encrypted biometric data registered to exactly 3 people worldwide, and had redundant systems specifically designed to prevent any kind of bypass. Yet, a homeless child had opened it with a single touch. "Everyone out." His voice cut through the noise like a blade. Everyone except Dr. Chen and Marcus. Now, the room emptied quickly, people filing out with backward glances at Ellie, who hadn't moved from her position by the vault. When the door finally closed, sealing them in silence, Adam turned to his head engineer with barely controlled fury. "Explain to me what just happened." Dr. Chen's hands shook as he examined the readouts on his tablet. "Sir, I can't." The biometric scanner registered her handprint, but it shouldn't have. The system doesn't just read prints, it reads subdermal vascular patterns, temperature signatures, even DNA markers through the skin. There's no way a random person could match the authorized profiles unless... He stopped, his face going pale. "Unless the system was intentionally overridden at the hardware level, which would require access we haven't given anyone. Or unless something else happened," Ellie said quietly. All 3 men turned to look at her. She had moved away from the vault now, and stood near the window, small and breakable against the backdrop of steel and glass. "Something you can't explain with your machines." Adam approached her slowly, the way someone might approach a wild animal or a ghost. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, mister. I just listened." She looked up at him with those impossibly calm eyes. "My mama, before she died, she told me something. She was in the hospital bed, and she could barely breathe. But she held my hand real tight, and she said, 'Ellie, God gave you something special, something that will help people see Him when they've forgotten how to look. One day He'll use what's inside you, and you can't ignore His whisper when it comes. Promise me you'll listen.'" Her voice wavered for the first time since she'd entered the room, and Adam saw moisture gathering in her eyes. "I didn't understand what she meant. But after she died, I started hearing things. Not like voices that scare you or make you do bad stuff, just quiet knowing. Like when you remember something important you almost forgot. And this morning, it told me to come here. Told me exactly which buttons to think about, which numbers mattered, like someone was showing me a map only I could see. Doctor, Chen set down his tablet with a hand that trembled. Sir, I need to run replication tests. If we can understand the sequence, she triggered. Do it, Adam commanded, not taking his eyes off Ellie. For the next 20 minutes, they watched Dr. Chen attempt to recreate whatever Ellie had done. He tried inputting the recorded sequence from the vault's internal logs. He attempted to mimic the exact placement of her hand on the scanner. He even had Ellie describe everything she'd felt and thought during those crucial seconds. Nothing worked. The vault, once opened, had reset to its locked state, and now refused every attempt to breach it again. After the 15th failed try, Dr. Chen removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the exhaustion of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been dismantled. This is beyond any security protocol I've ever encountered. The encryption we're seeing would require quantum computing capabilities and clearance levels that don't exist outside of classified military operations. He looked at Ellie, as if seeing her for the first time. Or it requires something I don't have categories for. Adam felt something crack open inside his chest. A fissure in the carefully constructed wall he'd built between his present and his past. He looked at Ellie, really looked at her. And suddenly, he wasn't seeing a homeless child in his boardroom. He was seeing himself at 8 years old, standing in line at a soup kitchen while his mother worked her third job. He was remembering the night he'd slept in a subway car because their apartment heat had been shut off. He was feeling again the desperate hunger that made you dizzy, the shame that made you invisible, the loneliness of knowing that the world had decided you didn't matter. But he also remembered something else, a moment so buried he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. He'd been 10, stealing food from a corner store because he hadn't eaten in 2 days. The owner had caught him, had every right to call the police. Instead, the man had looked at him with something Adam only now recognized as compassion and said, "You're worth more than this, son. Don't let hunger make you forget." Then he'd given Adam a bag of groceries and his phone number, told him to call if things got desperate. Adam had never called. He'd been too proud, too determined to prove he didn't need anyone's charity. But he'd never forgotten that moment of unearned grace. He walked to his desk and pulled out his checkbook with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit. $100 million, he'd said. The words had been a joke, a cruel game played by a powerful man who'd forgotten what powerlessness felt like. But Ellie had done the impossible. She'd earned it in a way his engineers couldn't explain and his lawyers couldn't argue against. He wrote the check, his handwriting barely legible, and held it out to her. Ellie looked at the paper, at the string of zeros that represented more money than existed in the comprehension of a 9-year-old, and then she did something that broke Adam Sterling, in a way business rivals and market crashes never could. She gently pushed his hand away. "I don't need your money, mister," she said softly. "I need you to help kids like me, kids who are hungry and scared and sleeping in places that aren't safe. Kids God hasn't forgotten even when everybody else did." The room went completely still. Marcus looked away, his jaw working. Dr. Chen stared at his equipment as if it might offer escape from the emotional weight pressing down on them all. And Adam felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years, not since the night his mother died and left him alone in a world that rewarded only the ruthless. He felt convicted that evening after arranging for Ellie to stay in one of the tower's furnished guest apartments. After ensuring she had food and clean clothes and medical attention, Adam stood outside her door and watched through the gap he'd left open. She was kneeling beside the bed, her small hands clasped together, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her hair, now clean and brushed, caught the lamplight. Her face, free of dirt, showed the delicate features of a child who should have been worrying about homework and friendships, not survival and hunger. Adam felt his throat tighten. He'd spent 2 decades building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and influence, telling himself it was all worth it because he'd escaped poverty's trap. But looking at Ellie now, he realized he'd built his success on amnesia, on forgetting deliberately what it felt like to be her. And in forgetting, he'd lost something essential, something that girl had somehow kept despite losing everything. She'd kept her faith that someone was listening, that someone cared. He turned away from the door and walked to the window of his own penthouse suite. Manhattan glittered below him, a city of 8 million stories, most of them invisible from this height. For the first time in years, he thought about the people behind those lights, the ones struggling, hoping, praying for miracles they had no reason to expect. And for the first time in 20 years, Adam Sterling whispered into the darkness of his room, "God, if you're real like she says, show me." The city offered no answer. But somewhere in the guest room down the hall, a little girl smiled in her sleep, her prayers complete, already knowing that he had. 3 nights after Ellie opened the vault, Adam Sterling did something he hadn't done in 2 decades. He dismissed his driver, left his penthouse without security, and walked into the parts of Manhattan that didn't appear in tourist brochures or real estate listings. He started in the Bronx, in the neighborhood where Ellie had told him she'd spent her first month on the streets. The contrast from Midtown was so stark, it felt like crossing into another country. Broken streetlights left entire blocks in shadow. Graffiti-covered walls like desperate prayers sprayed in paint. And everywhere, in doorways and beneath overpasses, and huddled against steam vents, were people the city had rendered invisible. Adam saw a boy no older than 12, sleeping on a flattened cardboard box, his jacket too thin for November's cold. He saw a young mother trying to nurse an infant while protecting both of them from the wind with nothing but a torn blanket. He saw teenagers who should have been worried about algebra tests, instead calculating which subway cars were safest to sleep in. But what broke him was the children's eyes. They carried a wariness that childhood should never know. A constant vigilance that came from learning too early that the world was not safe and no one was coming to help. He recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once, before he'd learned to hide it beneath expensive suits and manufactured confidence. He found the shelter Ellie had mentioned, a converted warehouse that smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair. The line to get in stretched around the block, and a weary security guard was already turning people away. Capacity reached. Try again tomorrow. Somewhere in that rejected crowd was a child who would spend tonight in danger, and no one with the power to change it seemed to care. Adam walked further, following half-remembered streets from his own childhood. He found the subway tunnel where homeless communities built camps from stolen shopping carts and salvaged tarps. He descended into that underground world, and what he saw there shattered the last of his carefully maintained denial. Families living in the dark, children doing homework by flashlight, people who worked full-time jobs but couldn't afford rent in a city that had priced out its own workforce. And then, on a corner he recognized from 30 years ago, Adam Sterling fell to his knees on the cold sidewalk and sobbed. The tears came from a place he'd thought he'd successfully cauterized. They carried the weight of every hungry night he'd endured as a child, every moment of shame and fear and desperate hope that someone would notice he was drowning. But they also carried something newer and more painful. The recognition that he'd become exactly what he'd once needed rescue from. Not an abuser or a drunk, but something perhaps worse. Someone with the power to help who had chosen to look away. People walked past him, this well-dressed man crying on a street corner, and they looked away the same way he'd been looking away for 20 years. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. Adam prayed for the first time since the night his mother died. The words came haltingly, rusty from disuse, stripped of any eloquence or theology. God, I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if I have any right to ask you for anything, but that little girl believes in you with everything she has, and she's lost more than I ever did. If you're real, if you care the way she says you do, then show me what I'm supposed to do. Because I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending I don't see them. The memory came unbidden then, sharp and clear, despite the decades he'd spent trying to bury it. He was 7 years old, and his father had come home drunk again. The beating that followed had been worse than usual, and his mother, trying to protect him, had taken the worst of it. Afterward, when his father passed out and the apartment finally fell silent, Adam had hidden in his closet and prayed with the desperate faith of a child who had nowhere else to turn. Please, God, make it stop. Please make him different. Please help us. Nothing had changed. His father drank until cirrhosis killed him when Adam was 13. His mother worked herself to exhaustion and died of a heart attack 3 years later. And Adam had learned that prayers were just words spoken into empty air, that God was either absent or indifferent, and that the only person you could rely on was yourself. He'd built his empire on that lesson. Work harder than anyone else. Trust no one. Show no weakness. Accumulate enough power and money that you'd never be vulnerable again. It had worked spectacularly. He'd escaped poverty and built something his younger self would have considered impossible. But Ellie's question echoed in his mind now, with uncomfortable clarity. What good is having everything if you can't help the people who have nothing? He'd built his empire on fear, not faith. And in doing so, he'd become the kind of man who could walk past suffering children and feel nothing. Adam pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. The press conference 3 days later sent shockwaves through the financial world. Adam Sterling, known for his ruthless business acumen and aversion to charitable causes, stood before a wall of cameras and announced the creation of the Parker Foundation for Hidden Genius, backed by an initial endowment of $500 million from his personal fortune. "We have failed our children," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Not just as individuals, but as a society. We have allowed brilliance to go unrecognized, potential to go undeveloped, and futures to go unrealized simply because those children had the misfortune of being born into poverty. I'm announcing today a national initiative to identify and nurture gifted children in shelters, foster care, juvenile facilities, and impoverished communities across America. We're going to find the invisible ones." The reaction was immediate and explosive. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. Major investors threatened to pull their money. Business partners questioned his sanity. The media couldn't decide if this was genuine philanthropy or an elaborate publicity stunt. Financial analysts predicted Sterling Global Ventures would suffer massive losses. Adam didn't back down. In interview after interview, he told Ellie's story, explaining how a homeless 9-year-old had accomplished what teams of experts could not. He challenged America to consider how many other Ellies were out there, unseen and underestimated, their gifts wasted because no one bothered to look. The story went viral within hours. News outlets ran segments asking, "Who is Ellie Parker?" Social media exploded with debates about childhood poverty and wasted potential. Churches incorporated her story into sermons about faith and divine surprises. Schools invited her to speak. Magazines wanted interviews. Within a week, people were calling her the girl God touched and the miracle child of Manhattan. Ellie handled the attention with the same calm certainty she'd shown in Adam's boardroom. When reporters asked how she'd opened the vault, she simply said, "God showed me." When they asked what she wanted, she redirected attention to the children still sleeping on streets. She refused to be made into a celebrity and insisted the focus remain on the mission. The Parker Foundation headquarters opened in a renovated building in the Bronx, intentionally located in one of the neighborhoods most people avoided. Adam hired educators, psychologists, and youth advocates who understood trauma and poverty from personal experience, not academic theory. They developed assessment tools that looked beyond standardized tests to identify different kinds of intelligence: spatial reasoning, emotional insight, creative problem solving, mechanical aptitude, artistic expression. Within 3 months, testing centers opened in 12 major cities. Within 6 months, they'd identified over 2,000 children with exceptional abilities who'd been written off by traditional education systems. Foster kids who could code complex algorithms, shelter residents who possessed perfect musical pitch, juvenile offenders with engineering minds that could redesign mechanical systems just by observing them. Ellie insisted on one non-negotiable principle. We find the invisible ones first. The ones everybody else gave up on. That's who God cares about most. One evening, as they stood together watching the sun set over the city from Adam's office, he turned to her with a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Ellie, are you ready to change America? She looked up at him with those clear eyes that seemed to see everything, and she smiled in a way that reminded him why he'd started this impossible journey. Yes, but it's God who will change them. We're just supposed to help people see what he's been doing all along. Within 8 months, the Parker Foundation had established testing centers in 43 cities across America. The rollout moved with a speed that shocked even Adam's most optimistic projections, driven by a combination of his business expertise and something he'd never relied on before: faith that the right doors would open when they needed to. The centers didn't look like traditional testing facilities. No sterile rooms or anxiety-inducing forms. Instead, they created spaces where children felt safe enough to reveal themselves. Art studios where traumatized kids could express what words couldn't capture. Maker labs where restless hands could build and tinker. Music rooms where emotions could flow through instruments. Computer stations where digital natives could demonstrate skills they'd taught themselves on library computers and stolen Wi-Fi. The discoveries were staggering. In Detroit, they found a 13-year-old former gang member who could diagnose mechanical problems in engines just by listening to them run. In Houston, a girl from a domestic violence shelter composed symphonies in her head and transcribed them with perfect notation despite never having formal lessons. In Philadelphia, a boy who'd aged out of foster care at 16 had taught himself 3 programming languages and designed an app that optimized food bank distribution networks. There was the 12-year-old in Atlanta who could solve complex mathematical proofs that stumped graduate students. The 10-year-old in Seattle whose paintings captured emotional truths that art critics called profound. The 15-year-old in Chicago who'd memorized the entire legal code and successfully argued cases in youth court. Each one had been invisible to systems designed to identify talent, written off because they came wrapped in poverty, trauma, and circumstances that made traditional education impossible. But success bred opposition. Conservative politicians accused Adam of promoting socialism and undermining family values. Progressive activists claimed he was exploiting vulnerable children for publicity. Cable news hosts debated whether the foundation was genuine charity or elaborate tax avoidance. Religious leaders split between those who saw divine work and those who called it blasphemous to attribute the vault incident to God. Then the Department of Child Services launched an investigation, questioning whether the foundation had proper licensing, whether the children were being manipulated, whether the whole operation violated regulations designed to protect minors. State officials in 3 jurisdictions moved to shut down testing centers, citing zoning violations and permit issues that everyone knew were pretexts. The attacks on Ellie herself were the cruelest. Tabloids dug into her mother's past, publishing stories about drug addiction and financial struggles. Social media trolls called her a fraud, claimed the vault incident was staged, suggested she was being coached by adults to play a role. Other children, jealous of the attention or pressured by adults with agendas, bullied her online and in person. Adam watched her weather it all, with a strength that humbled him. She prayed every morning and every night. Her faith unshaken by criticism. When reporters asked about the attacks, she responded with grace that seemed impossible for someone her age. People are scared of what they don't understand. I just hope they'll look at the other kids we're finding and see that God's been hiding treasures in broken places all along. The turning point came when a major network offered them an hour-long primetime interview. Adam's advisors warned against it, but Ellie insisted, "People need to hear the truth, not about me, about all of us." The interview aired on a Sunday evening, and 60 million Americans watched Adam Sterling and Ellie Parker sit side by side and tell their stories with unflinching honesty. The host, a veteran journalist known for asking uncomfortable questions, started gently but quickly pressed harder. "Mr. Sterling, critics say you're exploiting this child for publicity, that the vault incident was staged. How do you respond? Adam met the camera directly. I understand the skepticism. If someone had told me a year ago that a homeless child would crack a military-grade security system through divine guidance, I would have laughed them out of my office. But I was there. I watched it happen. And more importantly, I've spent the last 8 months watching hundreds of other forgotten children demonstrate abilities that defy conventional explanation. The question isn't whether Ellie is special. The question is why we've decided that only certain children deserve the chance to show us what they're capable of. The host turned to Ellie. You've become a symbol to many people, called the girl God touched. How does that feel? Ellie's response would be replayed on news channels for weeks afterward. She looked directly into the camera with those clear, unwavering eyes and spoke with a conviction that transcended her years. God didn't make me special. He made everyone special. People just stopped noticing. She paused, gathering her thoughts. There are kids right now, sleeping in subway cars, who could cure diseases if someone taught them chemistry. There are kids in shelters who could write books that change the world if someone gave them paper and believed they had something to say. There are kids in jail who could build companies if someone showed them that their life could be different. We just have to stop being too blind or too scared to look for it. The silence that followed her words stretched for several seconds. The host, a man who'd interviewed presidents and celebrities without visible emotion, blinked back tears. Then Adam did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He told the truth about his past. I was Ellie once, he said quietly. My father was an alcoholic who beat my mother and me until the day he died. We were so poor I wore the same shoes for 3 years until my toes broke through the front. I stole food because I was hungry. I slept in places that weren't safe. And every adult I encountered looked at me with either pity or disgust, like I was already a lost cause at 8 years old. His voice broke. I survived by becoming hard, by trusting no one, by building walls so high that nothing could hurt me again, and I told myself that was strength. He looked at Ellie with obvious affection. But this child, who's lost more than I ever did, chose faith instead of hardness. She stayed open when I closed myself off, and she's showing me that maybe the walls I built to protect myself were actually the same walls that made me forget who I was supposed to be. The interview went viral before it even finished airing. Within 24 hours, donations to the Parker Foundation increased by 800%. Volunteer applications crashed the website. Celebrities and athletes pledged support. Most importantly, legislators who'd been trying to shut down testing centers suddenly became champions of the cause, recognizing which way the wind of public opinion was blowing. 6 months later, the foundation hosted its first annual gala, and it was unlike any charity event Manhattan had ever seen. Instead of wealthy donors congratulating themselves, the evening belonged entirely to the children. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had been transformed into a showcase of human potential that society had nearly discarded. A former homeless teenager demonstrated the prosthetic limb he'd designed using recycled materials and basic engineering principles he'd taught himself from library books. A girl who'd survived sex trafficking performed an original piano composition that left half the audience in tears. A boy from juvenile detention presented his invention for purifying contaminated water using simple, inexpensive components that could save lives in developing nations. Story after story unfolded. Families reunited after the foundation located parents who'd lost their children to a system designed to separate rather than heal. Kids who'd been written off as learning disabled revealed they were actually gifted once someone tested them in ways that matched how their minds worked. Former gang members stood beside former victims, united now by the discovery that they both possessed talents the world had tried to destroy. Adam moved through the crowd, shaking hands and embracing children who months ago had been invisible to people like him. At one point, he found himself standing beside a woman who introduced herself as the mother of one of the kids in the program. My son was about to age out of foster care with nowhere to go, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Your foundation found him, tested him, discovered he's some kind of genius with spatial reasoning. Now, he's got a full scholarship to MIT. You saved his life. Adam shook his head. Ellie saved his life. She saved all of us. Later that evening, he made the announcement that would define the rest of his days. Standing at the podium with Ellie beside him, he revealed that he was donating half his personal fortune, roughly $3 billion, to permanently endow the Parker Foundation. Furthermore, he was stepping down from his position at Sterling Global Ventures to dedicate himself full-time to the foundation's mission. "I spent 20 years accumulating wealth," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I convinced myself that success was measured in buildings and bank accounts. But this child showed me something I'd forgotten. She showed me that the richest person isn't the one who has the most, but the one who sees the most, who notices the people everyone else walks past, who believes in potential that hasn't been given permission to bloom yet." He looked down at Ellie, with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "She saved me in ways money never could. She reminded me that I'm not defined by what I escaped, but by what I do with the escape." The applause was thunderous, but Adam barely heard it. He was watching Ellie, who stepped forward to the microphone, with a piece of paper clutched in her small hands. The room fell silent as she unfolded it, and when she spoke, her voice trembled but never broke. "I want to tell you about someone," she began. "Right now, somewhere in America, there's a kid who's hungry, who's scared, who's sleeping somewhere that isn't safe. Maybe they're in your city. Maybe they're on your street. You've probably walked past them and didn't even notice, because they're really good at being invisible." She paused, composing herself. "That kid might have a gift, something amazing that God put inside them. Maybe they can make art that speaks truth. Maybe they can solve problems nobody else can figure out. Maybe they can lead people, or heal people, or teach people, or build things that will change the world." Her voice grew stronger. "But right now, they're just trying to survive, and every day they stay invisible is a day their gift dies a little bit more." Ellie looked out at the sea of faces, wealthy and powerful people who'd come expecting a typical charity gala and instead found themselves confronted with uncomfortable truth. The next Ellie is out there right now, hungry, lonely, unseen. If you want to find a miracle, go where the world refuses to look, because that's where God hides his best treasures. In the broken places, in the forgotten people, in the kids everyone else gave up on. She smiled then, radiant and sure. "My mama told me before she died that God would use what's inside me. But she was wrong about one thing. It's not just me. It's all of us. Every single person he made. We just have to be brave enough to see it." The silence that followed was holy, pregnant with conviction and transformation. Then, someone began to applaud, and the sound grew until it filled the massive space. Hundreds of people on their feet, many crying openly, all of them changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. Adam stood beside Ellie, his hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt truly wealthy. Not because of what he possessed, but because of what he'd finally learned to see. God had sent a miracle disguised as a homeless child, and in saving her, she had saved him.